My money protects me. Judge Monroe makes history. The words hung in the courtroom like poison gas, and in that moment, Victoria Ashford sealed her fate before she even understood what justice meant. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button right now. The Superior Court of Hamilton County had seen its share of wealthy defendants, but never one quite like Victoria Ashford. She entered courtroom 6 that Tuesday morning, as if she were arriving at a charity gala she was hosting rather than attending. Her Hermes bag, worth more than most people's cars, swinging carelessly from her manicured hand. The clicking of her Louboutin heels on the marble floor echoed through the high-ceilinged chamber, each step a declaration of the privilege she wore like armor. Judge Elias Monroe sat at the bench, his silver hair catching the afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows. At 63, he had presided over this courtroom for nearly 2 decades, and his weathered face had witnessed every shade of human nature. But his dark eyes, sharp as ever behind wire-rimmed glasses, held something different today, a quiet intensity that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous ground for whoever stood on the wrong side of the law. The gallery was packed. Word had spread quickly about this case, and the courthouse reporters knew a story when they smelled one. Victoria Ashford, wife of real estate mogul Kenneth Ashford, was facing charges of vehicular assault and leaving the scene of an accident. But the details had made this case something more than just another wealthy person in legal trouble. District Attorney James Chen stood at the prosecution table, his file open before him, though he barely needed to reference it. He had memorized every word of every statement, every frame of the security footage, every medical report. Across the aisle, Victoria sat beside her attorney, Marcus Goldstein, a man whose $1,000 hourly rate was evident in everything from his custom suit to his practiced air of bored confidence. Victoria herself looked utterly unconcerned. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her cream-colored designer dress probably cost $5,000, and her expression suggested she was mildly inconvenienced by having to be here at all. She examined her nails, checked her phone twice before the bailiff called for it to be put away, and whispered something to her attorney that made her smile, a small, amused curve of lips that held no warmth whatsoever. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though Judge Monroe was already seated. The formality was observed nonetheless, and the rustling of the crowd settling back into the wooden benches filled the chamber before silence descended like a curtain. Judge Monroe's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of granite. "We are here today in the matter of the state versus Victoria Ashford. The defendant is charged with vehicular assault in the first degree and leaving the scene of an accident causing serious physical injury. Mr. Chen, you may proceed with your opening statement." The DA stood, buttoning his jacket in a gesture that had become second nature over 15 years of courtroom work. He approached the jury box, but his words were meant for everyone in that room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on the evening of March 14th, at approximately 8:47 p.m., Maria Santos was walking home from her second job as a night shift cleaner at Mercy General Hospital. Maria is a single mother of 3 children. She works 2 jobs to support her family. She was crossing Riverside Avenue at a marked crosswalk, with the pedestrian signal in her favor, when she was struck by a vehicle traveling at an estimated 45 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Chen paused, letting the image settle in their minds. The vehicle was a white Range Rover, registered to Kenneth Ashford but driven that night by his wife, Victoria Ashford, the defendant seated before you. The impact threw Maria Santos 30 feet. She suffered a shattered pelvis, a fractured spine, severe internal bleeding, and a traumatic brain injury. She was unconscious before she hit the pavement. A woman in the gallery gasped. Victoria Ashford didn't even blink. "But here's what makes this case particularly egregious," Chen continued, his voice hardening. "The defendant did not stop. Security footage from 3 different cameras shows the Range Rover striking Ms. Santos, slowing briefly, just for a moment, and then accelerating away. The defendant drove home, parked her vehicle in her garage, and went inside. When police arrived at her residence 4 hours later, she initially denied having been driving at all. Chen turned to look directly at Victoria. "The evidence will show that the defendant was texting while driving. The evidence will show that she was traveling well above the speed limit through a residential area. The evidence will show that she saw Maria Santos lying on that street critically injured, and made a conscious choice to drive away. And the evidence will show that when confronted with what she had done, her first instinct was not remorse, not concern for the woman she had nearly killed, but self-preservation and denial. He walked back to his table, his final words delivered with quiet fury. Maria Santos spent 3 months in the hospital. She will never walk without assistance again. She lost both of her jobs. Her medical bills exceed $700,000. Her children, ages 7, 9, and 11, had to watch their mother fight for her life because someone decided that a text message was more important than a human being. Because someone decided that their convenience mattered more than stopping to help a dying woman. We will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Victoria Ashford is guilty of every charge against her. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the court reporter seemed to have stopped breathing. Judge Monroe turned his gaze to the defense table. "Mr. Goldstein, your opening statement." Marcus Goldstein rose with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost a case he actually tried. His voice was smooth, measured, almost friendly. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened to Maria Santos is undoubtedly tragic. No one, least of all my client, disputes that a terrible accident occurred that night. But that's precisely what it was, an accident." He strolled toward the jury box, hands clasped behind his back. "The prosecution would have you believe that Mrs. Ashford is some kind of monster who deliberately struck a pedestrian and callously drove away. But the evidence, the actual evidence, not the emotional narrative, will tell a very different story. Mrs. Ashford was driving home that evening after a stressful day. Visibility was poor. The lighting at that particular crosswalk has been noted as inadequate in multiple city safety reports. And Ms. Santos, according to the traffic reconstruction analysis, was wearing dark clothing. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Chen's jaw tightened visibly. "As for leaving the scene," Goldstein continued, "my client has consistently maintained that she heard a sound, but did not realize she had struck a person. She thought perhaps she had hit a pothole or debris in the road. When she arrived home and examined her vehicle, she saw minor damage, but nothing that suggested serious impact. It wasn't until police arrived that she learned a pedestrian had been injured." "That's a lie," a voice called from the gallery, rough, accented, broken with emotion. A bailiff moved quickly toward the speaker, but Judge Monroe raised a hand. "Order," he said quietly, and somehow that single word carried more authority than a shouted command. The courtroom stilled instantly. His eyes found the speaker, a young woman mid-20s, with Maria Santos's same dark hair and eyes. "You will have your opportunity to speak when called to testify. Until then, silence is mandatory, not optional." The young woman, Maria's eldest daughter, Elena, nodded, tears streaming down her face, and sat back down. Goldstein continued as if the interruption had never occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen, we must separate tragedy from culpability. We must separate emotion from evidence. My client is a respected member of this community, a philanthropist, a mother herself. She has no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. The idea that she would knowingly flee the scene of a serious accident is simply incompatible with who she is." He returned to his seat, and Judge Monroe's expression remained utterly neutral, though those who knew him well might have detected a slight narrowing of his eyes. "Mr. Chen, call your first witness." The state calls Detective Marcus Thompson. The detective who had led the investigation took the stand, a 20-year veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor. After being sworn in, Chen walked him through the timeline of that night with methodical precision. "Detective Thompson, can you describe the condition of the defendant's vehicle when you examined it?" "The Range Rover showed significant front-end damage," Thompson replied, consulting his notes, though his memory of the case needed no refreshing. "The hood was dented, the front bumper was cracked, and there were biological materials, blood and tissue, embedded in the grille and undercarriage. The windshield had a spiderweb crack pattern on the passenger side, consistent with human impact. In your professional opinion, would a driver be able to mistake that kind of impact for hitting a pothole?" "Absolutely not," Thompson said flatly. "The force required to cause those injuries to Ms. Santos and that damage to the vehicle would have been unmistakable. The sound alone would have been significant. There would have been visible damage immediately apparent to any driver who examined their vehicle." Chen pulled up a photograph on the courtroom monitor, the Range Rover in the Ashford's garage. photographed by police. The damage was obvious even in the photo. Several jurors leaned forward. "What did Mrs. Ashford say when you first questioned her that night?" Thompson flipped a page in his notebook. Initially, she stated she had been home all evening. When I informed her that we had security footage placing her vehicle at the scene, she changed her story. She then claimed she had driven home earlier but didn't remember the exact time. When I asked about the damage to her vehicle, she said she had no idea how it happened. Did she ask about the victim? A pause. No, sir. Not once during our initial interview did she inquire about Ms. Santos's condition. The courtroom stirred. Victoria whispered something to Goldstein, looking annoyed. Chen continued. "Detective, did you obtain the defendant's phone records?" "Yes. They showed that she was actively texting at the time of the accident. She sent 3 text messages in the minute before impact and was in the middle of typing a 4th. What were those messages regarding?" "She was texting with a friend about dinner plans. The last complete message, sent 17 seconds before the estimated time of impact, read, 'I'll be there in 10. This city traffic is ridiculous.'" The irony hung in the air like smoke. A woman had been nearly killed because someone couldn't wait 10 minutes to discuss dinner reservations. Goldstein's cross-examination attempted to raise questions about the accuracy of the timeline, the possibility of phone records being misinterpreted, the limitations of security camera footage. But Thompson was an experienced witness, and his answers remained consistent and damning. The next witness was the trauma surgeon who had fought for 3 hours to save Maria Santos's life that night. Dr. Rachel Kim described injuries in clinical detail that somehow made them even more horrifying. The shattered pelvis that had required 12 pins and 2 metal plates, the spinal fractures, the internal bleeding that had necessitated removing her spleen, the brain swelling that had put her in a medically induced coma for 2 weeks. In your medical opinion, Dr. Kim, how much did the delay in receiving treatment affect the patient's long-term prognosis? Significantly, Dr. Kim replied, her professional composure barely concealing her anger. Ms. Santos lay on that street for approximately 8 minutes before someone called 911, another 6 minutes before paramedics arrived. If she had received immediate medical attention, if the person who hit her had stopped and called for help, we might have been able to prevent some of the permanent damage. The delay in treatment almost certainly contributed to the severity of her spinal cord injury and the extent of her brain damage. The words settled over the courtroom like a shroud. Victoria Ashford stared at her hands, her expression betraying nothing. Then came the witnesses who had been at the scene. A couple walking their dog who heard the impact and rushed to help. A convenience store clerk who ran out when he heard screams. The first responding paramedic. Each told the same story. Maria Santos lying in the street, grievously injured, while a white Range Rover's taillights disappeared into the night. But it was the security footage that proved devastating. Chen had the courtroom lights dimmed as he played the video on the large monitor. The timestamp in the corner read 8:47 p.m. The black and white footage showed Riverside Avenue from a mounted camera across the street. Maria Santos entered the frame, crossing at the marked crosswalk. Then came the Range Rover. Fast. Too fast. The impact was soundless but horrific to watch. Maria's body flew through the air like a discarded doll. Several jurors looked away. One covered her mouth. In the gallery, Elena Santos sobbed openly. But what came next was worse. The Range Rover stopped. For exactly 4 seconds, Chen had the video time-stamped. The vehicle sat motionless. The brake lights were on. The driver's door opened slightly, just a crack, visible in the glow of the streetlight, and then it closed. The brake lights went off, and the Range Rover drove away, not speeding now but at a careful, deliberate pace, like someone trying not to attract attention. When the lights came back up, several people in the gallery were crying. The jury looked shaken. Judge Monroe's face remained carved from stone, but his eyes had gone hard as flint. "Your Honor," Chen said, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. "The state calls Maria Santos." The courtroom doors opened, and a wheelchair rolled in, pushed by Elena. The woman in the chair looked 20 years older than her 42 years. Her once dark hair was streaked with gray. Her face was drawn, marked by pain that had become permanent. Her left arm hung at an awkward angle, the result of nerve damage. A breathing tube ran from her nose to a portable oxygen tank attached to the back of her wheelchair. It took several minutes to get Maria positioned where she could see both the judge and the jury. Her breathing was labored, audible in the silent courtroom. When she was sworn in, her voice was barely a whisper. Chen approached gently, respectfully. "Ms. Santos, thank you for being here today. Can you tell the jury what you remember from the night of March 14th? Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I was walking home from work. I cleaned the hospital at night, you know. I had just finished my shift. I was tired, my feet hurt." Her English was accented but clear, each word an effort. "I cross at the light. I always cross at the light, always wait for the signal. I teach my children, you wait for the signal." She paused, breathing heavily. Elena handed her a tissue. "I saw the white car. I saw it coming fast, too fast. I tried to move, but..." She made a helpless gesture. "It happened so fast. The pain was... I cannot describe. And then everything went dark." "Do you remember anything else? Anything between being struck and the paramedics arriving?" "I remember waking up for a moment. Just a moment. I was on the ground. Everything hurt so much. I could not move. I tried to call for help, but I could not make sound come. And I remember thinking about my children. Who would pick them up from school? Who would make their dinner?" The tears flowed freely now. "I thought I was going to die there, on that street, alone." The courtroom was utterly silent, except for the sound of Maria's labored breathing and scattered crying from the gallery. "Ms. Santos, can you describe how your life has changed since that night?" The question opened a floodgate. Maria spoke of 3 months in the hospital, of surgeries she couldn't count, of waking up unable to feel her legs. She spoke of her children visiting and being afraid of all the tubes and machines. She spoke of losing both her jobs, of medical bills that consumed every cent she had saved and then multiplied into debt she could never repay. "I cannot work anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I cannot walk. I cannot pick up my baby when he cries. I cannot cook dinner for my family. I cannot be the mother I was. Everything is taken from me. Everything." Chen let her words hang in the air before asking his final question. "Ms. Santos, do you see the person who hit you in this courtroom today?" Maria's eyes, swimming with tears, moved to the defense table, to Victoria Ashford, who sat with perfect posture, her face a mask of carefully constructed sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," Maria whispered. "That woman." Goldstein's cross-examination was brief and, to his credit, not cruel. He asked about the lighting conditions, about what Maria had been wearing, about whether she had looked both ways. But there was no shaking her testimony. She had crossed legally, carefully, doing everything right, and someone had destroyed her life and driven away. When Maria was wheeled out of the courtroom, the emotion was palpable. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. The gallery sat in stunned silence. And Judge Monroe, who had seen countless victims testify over 2 decades, looked at the defense table with an expression that would have made a wiser person very, very afraid. The prosecution rested. Goldstein called a series of witnesses designed to establish Victoria's character. Friends who spoke of her charity work, her children's teachers who praised her involvement, a domestic violence shelter director who testified about her generous donations. But it all felt hollow against the weight of what had been presented. And then Goldstein made a decision that, in retrospect, proved catastrophic. He called Victoria Ashford to the stand. She took the oath with practiced grace, settling into the witness chair as if it were a throne at one of her fundraising galas. Goldstein led her through carefully prepared questions about that night, about her state of mind, about the horror she felt upon learning what had happened. "Mrs. Ashford, did you intentionally strike Maria Santos with your vehicle?" "Absolutely not," Victoria said, her voice steady, tinged with just the right amount of emotion. "I could never do something like that intentionally. And when you heard the impact, why did you not stop?" "I genuinely thought I had hit something in the road, perhaps a pothole or debris. The area was poorly lit, and I was focused on getting home. I had no idea at all, that I had struck a person." "When you opened your car door at the scene, what were you doing?" A moment's hesitation. I was trying to see if there was damage, but it was dark, and I didn't see anything, so I closed the door and drove home. It was a polished performance, rehearsed but not obviously so, and it might have worked, might have created just enough reasonable doubt, if Chen hadn't been an exceptional prosecutor. His cross-examination began gently. almost conversationally. "Mrs. Ashford, you testified that you thought you had hit a pothole. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And yet you opened your door to check for damage. If you thought it was just a pothole, why would you need to check for damage severe enough to require you to stop?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Victoria's face. It was a hard impact. I wanted to be certain. A hard impact. Hard enough to make you stop and open your door, but not hard enough to make you think you should call the police or check what you had actually hit. I didn't realize..." "Mrs. Ashford, you own a Range Rover. That's a substantial vehicle. You were traveling, according to the traffic analysis, at approximately 45 miles per hour. The impact threw Maria Santos 30 feet through the air. Are you really testifying that you thought that kind of impact was a pothole?" Victoria's composure began to crack. It was dark. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. Chen pulled up the security footage again, freezing it at the moment when the car door opened. "What do you see when you look at this footage, Mrs. Ashford?" "My car." "And what's that on the ground in front of your car, illuminated by your headlights?" The image was grainy, but unmistakable. A dark shape on the ground. A human shape. "I couldn't see clearly from inside the vehicle," Victoria insisted. "But you opened your door. You had a clear line of sight. You're telling this jury that you looked directly at Maria Santos lying on the ground and saw nothing? I didn't know what I was seeing. It could have been anything. A bag, debris, a bag that was bleeding, debris that was wearing clothing. Mrs. Ashford, the biological evidence shows that there was blood on your front bumper, visible from outside the vehicle. Are you saying you didn't see any of that?" "No, I didn't look that carefully." Chen's voice sharpened. "You didn't look carefully. You struck something with enough force to crack your windshield, opened your door, saw something on the ground in front of your car, and you didn't look carefully before driving away. I panicked, all right?" Victoria's voice rose, her careful composure shattering. "I panicked. Is that what you want to hear?" The courtroom went electric. Goldstein looked like he wanted to crawl under his table. "You panicked," Chen repeated slowly. "So, you did know something was wrong?" That's not what I meant. Mrs. Ashford, let me ask you directly. When you opened that car door and looked out, did you see Maria Santos?" "No." "Did you see a person lying on the ground?" "I saw something, but I didn't know what it was." "And your first instinct upon seeing something you didn't recognize after a hard impact was to drive away?" "I was scared." "Scared of what? Of being held accountable?" "Objection." Goldstein was on his feet. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Monroe said quietly. But the damage was done. Chen paced back, letting the moment breathe. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "Mrs. Ashford, how much do you think Maria Santos makes in a year, working 2 jobs?" "Objection. Relevance." "I'll allow it," Judge Monroe said, and there was something in his tone that made Goldstein sit down. I have no idea," Victoria said. "Approximately $32,000, before taxes. She supported 3 children on that income. She walked to and from work to save money on bus fare. Do you know what your handbag costs, Mrs. Ashford? The one you brought to court today?" "I don't see what..." $8,000. Your bag costs more than a quarter of what Maria Santos earned in a year." Chen paused. "When you learned that you had hit someone, when police came to your door, did you ever think about the person you had injured? Did you wonder if they had a family? If they were alive? Did you feel any concern for them at all?" Victoria's face flushed red. "Of course I did." "Then why, in 4 hours of initial police questioning, did you never once ask about the victim's condition?" "I was in shock." "You were in shock. Too much shock to ask if the person you hit was alive, but not too much shock to hire Marcus Goldstein within 3 hours of being questioned. Not too much shock to have your husband's assistant call the chief of police before dawn the next morning. Not too much shock to start building your legal defense immediately." "I have a right to defend myself." "You do," Chen agreed. "Just as Maria Santos had a right to medical attention, but she lay bleeding in the street while you were making phone calls to your lawyer." The words hung in the air like an indictment all their own, and then Chen asked the question that would define the entire trial. "Mrs. Ashford, do you believe you should be held to the same standard of accountability as everyone else?" Something shifted in Victoria's expression. A flash of the real person beneath the carefully constructed defendant. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. Do you believe that you, Victoria Ashford, should face the same consequences as anyone else who did what you did? I've done nothing wrong. That's not what I asked. Should the law apply to you the same way it applies to everyone else? Of course, but what? And there it was, the moment when pride overwhelmed prudence, when privilege asserted itself so automatically that Victoria couldn't even see the trap she was walking into. But you have to understand the context, she said, her voice taking on an edge of impatience. I'm not some criminal. I have a family. I have responsibilities. I contribute to this community. I shouldn't be sitting here being treated like some common... She stopped herself, but too late. Like some common what, Mrs. Ashford? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Please, explain to this jury what makes you different, what makes you special, what makes you above the law that applies to everyone else. Victoria's face was red now, her composure completely shattered, and then she said it. The words that would be replayed on every news station that night. The words that would define her forever. My money protects me. That's reality. That's how the world works. People like me don't go to prison for accidents because we have resources. We have connections. We have attorneys who know how to navigate the system. This whole trial is a farce designed to appease people who don't understand that wealth comes with different considerations. The courtroom erupted. The gallery burst into shouts and gasps. Bailiffs moved to restore order. Goldstein had his head in his hands. Chen stood motionless, knowing that a prosecutor dreams their entire career of a moment like this. Judge Monroe's gavel came down once, just once, and somehow that single strike silenced the entire room. Mrs. Ashford, he said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. I want to be absolutely certain I understood your testimony correctly. Are you stating, under oath, that you believe your wealth should protect you from the legal consequences of your actions? Victoria seemed to realize finally what she had done. Your Honor, I was upset. I didn't mean... Answer the question. Do you believe your financial status entitles you to different treatment under the law? No. I mean, that's how things work sometimes, but how things work, Judge Monroe repeated. Not how they should work, how they do work. Is that your testimony? Victoria looked desperately at her attorney, but Goldstein couldn't save her from this. No one could. Yes, sometimes. But that doesn't mean... Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. That will be all. The redirect examination was brief and disastrous. Nothing Goldstein tried could unring that bell. When Victoria finally left the stand, she looked smaller somehow, diminished by her own words. Both sides rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning, but everyone in that courtroom knew the trial was already over. A jury that might have been swayed by reasonable doubt, by arguments about visibility and intent, had just heard a defendant declare that her wealth should place her above the law. The next day, Chen's closing argument was passionate, but unnecessary. The case had been made. Goldstein did his professional best, but his heart wasn't in it. How do you defend someone who had defended themselves so indefensibly? The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned with verdicts of guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Victoria was released on bail, and Judge Monroe spent those 2 weeks reviewing precedents, reading impact statements, and considering what justice actually meant in this case. When they reconvened, the courtroom was even more packed than before. The media circus had intensified. Victoria's family sat in the front row, her husband Kenneth, their 2 teenage children, her parents. On the other side sat Maria Santos in her wheelchair, surrounded by her children and extended family. Judge Monroe entered, and the room fell silent with a speed and completeness that testified to the gravity of the moment. The defendant will rise, he said. Victoria stood, her attorney beside her. She looked pale but composed, though her hands trembled slightly. Judge Monroe's voice, when he began, was measured and deliberate. Mrs. Ashford, I have presided over this courtroom for 19 years. I have seen thousands of cases. I have sentenced hundreds of defendants. And I have developed, over those years, a fairly accurate sense of who truly understands what they've done and who merely regrets being caught. He paused, his eyes fixed on Victoria. You struck Maria Santos with your vehicle while texting and driving well over the speed limit. You saw her lying in the street, critically injured, and you made a choice. You chose your convenience over her life. You chose to protect yourself rather than help her. And then, when brought to account, you chose to rely on your wealth and privilege to escape justice. His voice hardened. But the most revealing moment of this entire trial came when you testified, when you declared, under oath, that your money protects you, that people like you don't face consequences because you have resources and connections. You didn't just describe a belief, you described a worldview, one where human worth is measured in dollars, where accountability is for the poor, but not the privileged. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. Let me be absolutely clear about something, Mrs. Ashford. Your money does not protect you, not here, not in this courtroom, not in my presence. The law applies equally to every person who stands before this bench, whether they arrive in a Range Rover or a wheelchair, whether they wear designer clothing or second-hand shoes, whether they can afford Marcus Goldstein or must rely on a public defender. He picked up a document. I have read Maria Santos's victim impact statement. I have read statements from her children, her sister, her former employers, her doctors. I have read about the small apartment she can no longer afford, about the medical debt that will follow her family for decades, about the 8-year-old boy who asks his sister every night when mommy will be able to walk again. His voice roughened. And I have read your statement, Mrs. Ashford. And I note that even now, even after everything, you still frame this as an accident that happened to you. You speak of your family's suffering, your embarrassment, your stress. You express regret for the unfortunate incident. But I see very little evidence that you truly comprehend the magnitude of what you did to another human being. He set the papers down. The sentencing guidelines for your crimes suggest a range of probabilities. Your attorney has argued for probation, community service, suspended sentences. The prosecution has argued for the maximum penalties. I have considered both arguments carefully. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Victoria Ashford, on the charge of vehicular assault in the first degree, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. On the charge of leaving the scene of an accident causing serious injury, I sentence you to an additional 5 years to be served consecutively. Total sentence, 20 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 85% of your sentence. Gasps erupted throughout the gallery. Victoria's face went white. Her mother cried out. Kenneth Ashford stood up, shouting something about appeals. Judge Monroe's gavel came down. I am not finished. In addition to the prison sentence, I am ordering full financial restitution for all of Maria Santos's medical expenses, past, present, and projected future costs. I am ordering compensation for lost wages and lost earning capacity. The total restitution amount will be determined by a separate hearing, but I anticipate it will exceed $2 million. He looked directly at Victoria, whose legs seemed barely able to support her. Furthermore, your driver's license is permanently revoked. You will never legally operate a vehicle again in this state. Goldstein was on his feet. Your Honor, this sentence is excessive, unprecedented. My client has no criminal history. Your client, Judge Monroe interrupted, his voice cutting like steel, demonstrated a fundamental contempt for human life and for the rule of law. She endangered everyone on that street through reckless behavior. She left a critically injured woman to die. She lied to investigators. She attempted to use her wealth to evade accountability. And she testified in my courtroom that she believed her money entitled her to special treatment. He stood, and though he was not a tall man, he seemed to tower over the courtroom. Let me send a message that will be heard far beyond these walls. Justice is not for sale. It is not reserved for those who can afford it. It is not diminished by poverty or enhanced by wealth. When you stand in this courtroom, you stand equal before the law, equal in rights, equal in dignity, and equal in accountability. His eyes swept the gallery, the jury box, the reporters frantically taking notes. Maria Santos has a lifetime sentence. She will never walk unassisted again. She will live with pain every day for the rest of her life. Her children will grow up watching their mother struggle with tasks that used to be effortless. That sentence was imposed by Mrs. Ashford's choices. It is only fitting that Mrs. Ashford face consequences that reflect the gravity of what she has done. He turned back to Victoria. The bailiff will remand you into custody immediately. You have the right to appeal. But I want you to understand something. This sentence is not vengeance. It is not cruelty. It is justice. It is the same justice that would be applied to anyone who did what you did. Your money doesn't protect you. Your connections don't protect you. The only thing that could have protected you was making different choices that night. And you chose poorly. The bailiffs approached. Victoria seemed unable to move, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Kenneth Ashford was shouting about appeals and wrongful sentencing and judicial overreach. Victoria's children were crying, but from the other side of the courtroom came a different sound. Maria Santos, tears streaming down her face, whispered something in Spanish. Elena translated for those nearby. Thank you for seeing us." As the bailiffs led Victoria away, she turned back once, and her eyes met Judge Monroe's. In that moment, perhaps for the first time, reality pierced the bubble of privilege she had lived in her entire life. She was going to prison for 20 years, not because the system had failed, but because it had finally worked the way it was supposed to. Judge Monroe gathered his papers, his face grave but satisfied. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell one final time. In the months that followed, the case became a national reference point in discussions about privilege, accountability, and justice. Victoria Ashford's statement, "My money protects me," became a rallying cry for reform advocates. Judge Monroe received both praise and death threats, but his sentencing stood through multiple appeals. Maria Santos received her restitution payments. They didn't heal her body, but they ensured her children could continue their education and that she would have proper care for the rest of her life. Elena started law school, determined to fight for people like her mother. And Victoria Ashford, in a women's correctional facility 300 miles from her former mansion, learned the hardest lesson of her life, that some protections, some privileges, end at the courtroom door. That justice, when it finally arrives, is blind to everything but the truth. Judge Monroe continued his work day after day, case after case, ensuring that everyone who stood before him stood on equal ground, because that's what justice means. That's what it has always meant. That's what it must always mean. If this story of justice restored your faith in the legal system, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to this channel. Comment "Justice for All" if you believe everyone deserves equal treatment under the law, or tell us where you're watching from. Let's build a community that stands for accountability, dignity, and the principle that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law.